In this talk, I want to talk about implementations of Sphinx, in particular how to efficiently implement the hash functions, what hash functions we should choose, and how does that influence the performance on different platforms. We already had a short introduction on Sphinx, so just to quickly give an overview again about the parameter sizes. So the nice thing is, it's a hash-based signature scheme, so we have minimal assumptions. It's stateless, and if you can get away with fairly big signatures, and also the signing time is quite costly, but otherwise it's a very nice scheme and provides a good conservative security. But the question is now, how should we instantiate Sphinx? So what should you take care of when you do this? What's the influence on the performance? You've already seen Sphinx before, so I just want to quickly go again over it. What it really is, we have three main components. So we use a one-time signature, a few-time signature, and Merkle trees. So another picture of this virtual tree structure. So the basic idea behind Sphinx is we have like this Merkle trees here, and the leaves are used to sign roots of other Merkle trees. And we do this for a certain number of layers, and at the end we sign the root of Horst, which is the few-time signature scheme. So we don't need to know any details about this. It's basically we're doing a lot of trees and a lot of one-time signatures, and in the end, a few-time signature. If you look at it in one of these triangles, it's basically just the Merkle tree, and in the leaves we have the public keys of the one-time signature. So what are we doing here? What are we computing? Well, it's just hash calls. So all we do is we compute hash chains and Merkle trees. So there are many, many calls. We have many layers of this, but all we do is computing hash chains, computing hash trees. And what's specific to this is it's very limited in the input sizes. So here we basically have a one-to-one function, and here a two-to-one function. So contrary to general cryptographic hash functions, we don't have to process arbitrary sized inputs. So to give you some feeling like how many hash computations we do. So if you want to do one signature in Sphinx, we do almost 500,000 calls to the one-to-one function, which we have to do in the hash chains, and almost 100,000 calls to the H function, which we have in the Merkle trees. So overall, around 500,000 hash computations. So how could we now instantiate F and H? Because there's a lot of choices. I mean, we can instantiate with any secure hash function. So what should we use? What could we use? There's a huge pool. So the first thing which comes to mind is, we want something secure. We use the standards. We could use like SHA-2 or SHA-3. In the original Sphinx paper, they opted for basically a sponge based on the Cha-Cha commutation, because this is so the whole instantiation is very performance critical. So you want to have something which is really fast. So Cha-Cha is very fast in software, so it fits very nicely. So now I picked another few candidates which look promising. So maybe we should not use exactly the SHA-3 standard, but use something based on catch-up. So maybe there are better parameter choices which lead to a better performance in Sphinx. And then the last two, which you're probably least familiar, some more recent proposals, which are extremely performant on current platforms by using the AES round function. So the main idea is you construct the hash function based from the AES, and then you can utilize the hardware support from modern macro architectures to implement those functions very efficiently. So what are the issues? Well, you can use SHA-2, and it's nice, it uses 512-bit message blocks. So we've seen before we need a function for mapping from 256 to 256. and a function from 512 to 256. So it seems to fit well, but yeah, if you want to follow the standard, you have to do the padding. So, well, you can implement this f function with a single call to the SHA-2 compression function. Because of the padding, we have to do 2 compression function calls. So maybe you don't want to follow the standard here exactly, because if you wouldn't use the padding, I mean, we have a fixed input size, so it's not an issue, and if we want to separate the functions, we could do that by using a different IV, for instance, and that would save a whole compression function call. So, in the remainder of the talk, when I talk about SHA-2, I take into account this optimization. We just heard a bit about the sponge construction, so SHA-3 is based on this, and as defined in the standard, the nice thing is it has very big message blocks, so we can fit everything in, and we only need a single call to the permutation. We only have one block, apply the permutation, and we take out the hash. Well, it's nice, we only need one permutation, but it's a huge permutation. So we could absorb 1088-bit message blocks, but we never need more than 512 bit. So it's a huge overhead. So to explore this a bit more, like what you could actually get out of Ketchup, in this work I suggested to reduce the size of the permutation, so only use 800-bit permutation, and use less rounds. So there was also recently proposed by the Ketchup team, a variant of Ketchup, basically using half the number of rounds, because now after 10 years we understand a bit better the security level of Ketchup. And also it uses some tree hashing mode to parallelize the sponge. And this might be okay, because when we look at the cryptanalysis, it suggests that we can break only less than half the rounds for pre-match resistance. So in order to see what's the best we could get out of Ketchup, when I speak of Ketchup now, it will always be this 800-bit permutation with less rounds, just as a comparison where you can go with the performance. Yeah, then as I mentioned previously, chapter 12, so that's the original proposal in the Sphinx paper. And then the 2 other constructions. So one is a recently proposed short input hash function. So as I said, it's based on AES rounds. And the main idea is you just build the permutation. You have different AES states. Apply the AES round to each of these states. Mix those states. Apply the AES rounds. Mix those states. Do that for a certain number of rounds. And all you need for implementing is the AES round function in this mixing. So this is what happens inside this permutation. And then you use a feed forward to make it non-invertible. So a very, very similar proposal is Impera. It also uses the same idea. We just use the AES round function, but in this case it's a Feistel network. So we either have 2 or 4 branches if we want to have the 256 and 512-bit permutation, and then we iterate that for a certain number of rounds. And we can plug it in the same construction as proposed in the Haraka paper. So now we have like our candidates which we want to look at, how they perform inside Sphinx. Well, the question is like where do we deploy Sphinx? Like what are the platforms we're actually interested in? So in this work we focus mostly on more high-end platforms because that's where Sphinx is more applicable. There has been one paper on trying to implement, or they implemented Sphinx on a microcontroller, and also showed how you can deal with all the issues, because so you have a 41 kilobyte signature, but the microcontroller maybe only has 16 kilobyte of RAM. So you can't even fit the signature inside the RAM. So you can still do it, but it will be very slow. Nonetheless, you should maybe not disregard those platforms completely because the verification is cheap. So if you just use Sphinx to sign in some firmware, so you might be able to do the verification part on the resource-constrained devices. So in this talk, I will only focus on the Intel Skylake and AMD Risen platforms, and on the ARM Cortex A57. In the paper, you will also find more performance figures for Intel Haswell and another Cortex platform. Okay, so what are the tricks now to get the fast implementation? Well, there are a lot of things we can do on modern microarchitectures to really speed up our implementation. So the typical thing is vectorization. So depending on the architecture, you have these vector instructions which allow you to parallelize inside the instruction and apply the same operation to all elements of your vector. Then you also have hardware support. So as I mentioned already, for AES, you have hardware support. So you can directly do one AES round with one instruction. But also for SHA-2, you have hardware support. And in the future, SHA-3. Another important aspect is how to utilize the pipeline. I will quickly show a few things on which are not necessarily limited to implementing these hash functions here, but are just general things to speed up implementations. So the idea behind vector instructions is you split up, you have a vector with a certain number of elements, and you can apply the same operation to all of these elements. This is extremely useful if you have independent data. Like when we look at the Sphinx and we compute these hash chains, we will always have independent data available. We have this huge tree, and inherently we can easily find independent data where we apply the same operations. It gets a bit more costly if you have to have interaction on the states. So if I want to like XOR element Y0 to Y7, then I usually have to reorder data, and I want to avoid those things, but this is not an issue in the implementations here. So the second important thing is pipeline. So for instance, this is an example on Intel Skylake. I have this instruction which does one AES round. So I can just call it, it does one AES round. But I think the grid is hard to see here, but it takes 4 cycles. So these are the cycles. It takes 4 cycles until you get the result for the AES computation. And then you could compute the next AES round. So if we just do this in a serial way, it will be a lot of time wasted on waiting for the results. But the nice thing is we have this pipeline. So even though we have to wait 4 cycles for the result, if we have another independent data, we can just issue another instruction after 1 cycle already. So if we have a lot of independent blocks, like we do in hash-based signatures, we can very nicely utilize this feature. So one thing we noticed when implementing this is that actually the performance varies a lot between the platforms. So just a simple vectorized XOR is so both on the Intel and AMD, the latency is 1. However, on ARM, if you use the vector instructions there, the XOR actually has latency of 3. So you have to wait 3 cycles until you get the result of the XOR. But the same thing is on this inverse throughput. So here, this inverse throughput was 1, so we have to wait 1 cycle until we can issue the next instruction. There's also quite a lot of variance on this. So in Intel, I could basically, so this is below 1. So this looks very weird, because I mean, I can't do a 3rd cycle. But what that means in this context is that I can issue 3 XOR instructions in 1 cycle, if I have independent data. Or similar on AMD, I can issue 2 XOR instructions in 1 cycle. However, on ARM, I have to wait a bit until I can issue the next vectorized XOR. Okay, now just a quick overview how to implement those functions efficiently. And I will only go briefly into this, but if you're interested, you can look at the paper or look at the implementations directly. So the main thing is, if you want to implement SHA-2 efficiently, vectorize it. It's 32-bit word-oriented, so if you have a 256-bit vector, you can easily do 8 computations in parallel. or you can use the hardware support. Same with Ketchup. So this is now with the 800-bit permutation, which is also 32-bit word oriented. Same thing, just vectorize it. You can do 8 calls to this permutation in parallel. Same for Cha-Cha, same concept, vectorize it. 8 times in parallel, easy. So the last two, as I said, it's just AES rounds. And you can implement both of them just with the AES instructions. But so both of these designs have been designed originally with the Intel instruction set in mind. So there's quite some, it's a bit a nuisance if you go on ARM because they have a different structure of the AES instructions. For instance, on ARM, they split it in 2 instructions, and also the key addition is not at the big, Intel, the key addition is in the end. On ARM, it's in the beginning. For instance, in Simpera, you have this Feistel network, so you have to do 1 XOR per round. And this you get for free on Intel, but on ARM, you can't utilize this, so you suddenly have to spend an XOR extra, which doesn't sound much, but if your 1 round is just 1 AES instruction and 1 XOR, it gets quite some overhead. And similar issues happen in Harakal. So there the XOR is used to add the constants, the round constants. And now the order is different. So the good thing is that you can just apply the linear transformations of AES and compute new round constants to get the same performance figures or the same number of instructions you need. Okay, so now we have all these hash functions, we have all these platforms. Let's have a little race. So our first tour will be on the Intel Skylake, which is very widely used processors. So there are a lot of new generations already out, but from the architecture they are very similar. So the performance figures, if you use now a Kaby Lake or something, will be very similar. And the main features here are, we have AVX2, 256-bit vectors, and AES support. So we will only be looking here at signing. So signing is the most costly operation. And in the paper you can also find the numbers for key generation, verification. Okay, so on the Skylake, in 5th place, SHA-256 with 142 million cycles, followed by Ketchup with 108 million cycles, then the bronze medal for Cha-Cha with 43 million cycles. Then silver medal for Simpera, 28 million cycles. And a gold medal for Harakal for only having 20 million cycles. So the difference between the fastest and slowest scheme here is already factor 7. So let's go to the next stage. So we look at the latest AMT processors. So very similar, we have AVX2, 256-bit vectors. Then also AES support, but the interesting thing is you have basically 2 pipelines there. You can issue 2 AES instructions per cycle. And you also have SHA-256 instructions. So you both have stronger hardware support for SHA-2 and for AES. So in last place here, Ketchup with 189 million cycles, then Cha-Cha, and maybe not surprisingly, SHA-2 and the AES-based candidates are in the lead because, you have double the number of AES ports here and you have SHA-2 instructions. So last, let's look at a little bit different architecture. So we look at the ARM Cortex A57. So this is a very widely spread processors, and you will find it in a lot of smartphones. It also has hardware support for AES and SHA-2 and vector instructions, but the vectors are only 128-bit. So you can probably already suspect what's going to happen. So Ketchup now needs 376 million cycles, and that's mostly to do smaller vectors, but also, as you've seen before, we've seen this XOR in the vector implementation is much slower on ARM. And you have a lot of XORs in Ketchup. So this really hurts Ketchup on this platform. They are similar for Cha-Cha, and then it's again the same order for the hardware supported primitives. So maybe just a quick overview over the performance of the hash functions itself on these platforms. So you can see on Skylake, everything is between 0.6 and 5.5 cycles per byte. And you can see that both Ketchup and Chacha, they use heavily the vectorized instructions, which are a bit slower on AMD, so that's why the functions are slower. And especially on the Cortex A57, you can see that Ketchup really falls behind. This is also, of course, we have this 800-bit permutation, but for this F function, we only hash 256 bits. So there's again a lot of overhead here. So if we look at the comparison, so this is F and this is H. You basically have the number of cycles because you spend the same number of cycles on the permutation here than here. So to conclude this a bit, I want to also quickly address the NIST PQ submissions and how the performance figures from here apply there, or how could you use the implementations there. So the first thing is gravity sphinx. There it basically applies directly because the function signatures are similar. So you can use the same implementations basically. And actually they are already using Haraka in their submission, although with one more round. And the other thing is Sphinx Plus. So there the structure is a bit different because it uses this tweakable hash, which you need in order to get the multi-target protection. So there the function signatures is a bit different. So it's not directly applicable, and things like, for instance, Ketchup will look definitely better there because you need to hash a bit more input. So maybe to summarize, like, what should you take away from this? Well, the gap can be quite big. So between the fastest and slowest hash function here, the performance can vary up to 10 times. Another thing is, I didn't talk about the verification times, but they can be really fast. So on the AMD Risen, you can get down to like 250,000 cycles when you use Sphinx. What would be, of course, really nice is to predict what happens in the future, and we get some insight, but their platforms are not so widely available which support this. So one thing is, we will have larger vectors. So both Chacha and Ketchup will benefit from this a lot, and you can find this in some processors already. But I guess we still have to wait one generation until in all your consumer laptops you will find those. Another thing I saw is that Intel actually will have vectorized AES. So then you can apply this AES round on a 512-bit vector. So this would be really nice. It depends how it's implemented and what the exact performance figures of these instructions are. But this could be a really big speed up for both Haraka and Simpira. And another thing which was, I think, announced in December or so is that the ARM v8.4 will have SHA-3 instructions. So I don't know how they look, so maybe Roberto can leak something, but the question is, what will it be? How do they look? Can we directly use it? I guess it will only be for the larger permutation, so then maybe it doesn't make sense to reduce the permutation size because it will anyway be faster. But this will be quite interesting development, and hash-based signatures will benefit a lot from the improvements on these architectures. So if there are any questions, please ask me, and if you want to look at the implementations, they are all available on this link. Thank you.